Who's in charge?
I turned it down because yesterday was.
I can
Want to get 100 people.
I need everyone to do jumping jacks before we begin. To warm up the room.
Spots is not normally start, but
I don't know.
It's off the schedule because we set it for yesterday's. When there were 100 people here.
that would make sense.
Oh, thanks. Oh, thanks. I'm still cold.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Welcome everyone to Hayley's oration. It's been a pleasure to work with her this past semester. Hayley did a lot of independent research in modern philosophers and contemporary neuroscience. It's nice to see bringing those two disciplines together. So please join me in welcoming Hayley for her oration on angels and materials.
I'd first like to start by thanking my panel. Thank you, Dr. Shields, for helping me along this process and talking through various Thomistic philosophy, fitting in with random science facts that I had found. And thank you, Dr. Cepeda, for being my second reader, and thank you, Dr. Olson, for being my third panelist. Let's start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. What a piece of work is a man. How noble is his prefrontal cortex. How infinite is his parietal lobe. In form and moving, how mechanical and complex. And his hippocampus, how like a computer. And his cerebellum, how like a frog. The beauty of dissection, the paragon of neurology. Yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me, no, nor woman neither, though by your smiling you seem to say so. While this rendition of Hamlet's famous soliloquy is blasphemous, it is the perspective of the scientific world. Scientific materialism understands man as entirely the result of his mechanical mechanisms and processes, of his material mechanisms and processes. Everything can be explained by some function in the brain. René Descartes, in his philosophical works, took the new biological discoveries of his time and interpreted all of nature as an animatron. Man is only a machine operated by an angelic mind. Both modern neuroscience and René Descartes understand the definition of life in a way that Thomas Hobbes describes it in his Leviathan, in quote 1. He says, quote, "For seeing life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within. Why may we not say that all automata, engines that move themselves by springs and wheels as doth a watch, have an artificial life? For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body, such was intended by the artificer." In other words, life is entirely the motion of limbs. The soul is only the primary beginning or part that allows for the dominoes to fall. This is different than the traditional Aristotelian definition, who says that life is a combination of soul and body. The soul is, in quote 2, quote, "the primary act of a physical body capable of life." The difference between these two definitions is that rather than saying that is one principal part, Aristotle wants to say that there is some primary act, some principle that allows for the body to function, not an individual part. However, as we've come to develop in our scientific research, it's become less obvious that the soul is that primary principle. And we'd rather like to say that it is some principal part. For example, in the human brain, by my diagram, almost every action of the person can be pointed to some general area. For example, Aristotle's nutritive power of the soul is actually just a function of the brainstem that allows control in your digestive system, your circulatory system, your nervous system, anything that allows you to basically function as life. So instead of saying that the soul controls your metabolism, your reproduction, we'd rather like to say that the brainstem controls that. Similarly, with the sensitive powers, both exteriorly and interiorly, there is an organ along with your eye or ear that allows for you to take in sensory information. The temporal lobe is where your hearing is, the occipital lobe is where your sight is, the sensory cortex is where you distinguish touch, and the olfactory lobe, this little guy there, is your taste and smell. Similarly, with your interior powers, what Aquinas labels as the memorative power, the estimative power, common sense, etc. Those can be found in the parietal lobe, frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, and in your inner brain, the hippocampus is your memorative power. With your motive, that's controlled in your cerebellum and your motor cortex. And your appetitive, which are your appetites, can be said to be neurotransmitters rather than feelings. For example, the pineal gland, when you close your eyes, it releases melatonin, which makes you desire to sleep. The material processes explain a lot about man's behavior and actions. And in order to fix this confusion, to make it seem less like the soul is some spiritual aspect to animals and plants and ultimately humans, that we'd like to say that the soul is a unifying principle of organic material, that being cells, which is not saying anything different than what Aristotle's saying, but instead of calling it a primary act, we're going to call it a unifying principle. Now, why would we say that there is some unifying principle in man or in any sort of life? That even though we can say that there are general areas or organs that allow for different behaviors and functions in man, that those parts themselves are made up of individual cells, which are made up of organelles, which are made up of chemicals, and it goes on ad infinitum. Gottfried Leibniz, a modern physicist and philosopher, describes the organic mechanisms in quote 3. He says, quote, "To each primitive intellecti or each vital principle, there is perpetually united a certain natural mechanism, which comes to us under the name of an organic body. Which mechanism, moreover, even though it preserves its form in general, remains in flux, and is like a ship of Theseus, perpetually repaired. Nor, therefore, can we be certain that the smallest particle of matter received by us at birth remains in our body, even though the same mechanism is by degrees completely transformed, augmented, diminished, involved, or evolved." End quote. In other words, that while we can say there are particular mechanisms or organs that allow for our body to function, those organs themselves are made up of cells that are constantly replacing themselves and in a state of flux. Therefore, that by saying there is any sort of organization to cells is implying the definition of the soul that we mentioned, that the soul is a unifying principle of organic material. And that takes account for our nutritive power of the soul, that just the basic organization of our organs in our body necessitates that there is some organization by a soul, because it is constantly replacing itself and maintains organization despite constantly changing. So we have our foundation. Furthermore, we have our foundation that explains for plant life, animal life, and human life on a fundamental level that we can grow and reproduce and metabolize. However, we also see different types of life that has some sort of consciousness or sentience. For example, animals are able to perceive their reality in some mysterious way. Modern science defines sentient life as being able to perceive sensations because it has a neurological system. That the only reason that you are able to see or hear or feel is because you have nerves that are being stimulated throughout your body and telling your brain that you're feeling something. This can go from jellyfish with a couple nerves to the human brain that has a very complex system of nerves. And there is an undeniable connection between the electricity and sensation. In epileptic patients, for example, when they experience extremely high sensation and hallucinations, they are also releasing high amounts of brain waves, which means that the electrons in their brain are firing rapidly. And on the flip side, that electrical impulses in the brain can cause you to experience sensation. The difficulty, however, is not what sensation is, but what perception is, or how a physical body can have a subjective experience. This can be better understood with the analogy of a digital camera. That, similar to the eye, the digital camera takes in information through its lens. It takes in the photons that allow for it to see some sort of image in front of it. Similarly, our eyes takes in photons, which are felt, in a way, by the neurons in the brain, or in the eye. However, when a camera processes this information, it assigns certain pixels to certain colors. But when an organism experiences sight, they see an entire image. Aristotle explains this difference in quote 4 when he says, "Granted then that the soul knows and perceives the elements of which each of these is formed, yet it will not know or perceive wholes, such as what divinity is, or man, or flesh, or anything else compounded. For the elements of these are not interrelated at random, but by some ratio or principle of composition. So there is no use supposing elements to be in the soul, unless there are in it also principles and coordination." End quote. Aristotle is saying here that while it is true that there are individual elements that seem to be allowing for some sort of sensation, that there needs to be an organization of the whole image, that the random electron firings in your brain do not necessitate coordination amongst them. Therefore, when we say that sentience is some sort of organization of electron firings, that is also saying what we've said about the soul. That is a unifying principle of organic material, but in this sense, it's the unifying principle of neurons. Dean Wooldridge, a materialist scientist himself, describes the phenomenon of sentience in quote 5 when he says, quote, "What is required to fit the facts, therefore, is not a theory that assigns a tiny bit of consciousness to every atom of matter. It does not even appear that consciousness is an inevitable property of complex computing or logical processing structures. Instead, the evidence suggests that the property of consciousness is possessed only by a very special organization of matter, of types yet to be determined, when placed in a suitable electrochemical state. That is still unknown." End quote. But what we've said about our soul is this special organization of matter that allows for sensation to happen. Similarly, with motion, is that the individual, which is also caused, at least in the human body, it's caused by electrical impulses which allow muscles to contract and relax. That you need a unifying principle to have entire motions that happen automatically rather than individual neurons. And with appetites, is you're feeling tired, not I'm feeling this amount of melatonin. That there is you coordinate your feeling to be one thing rather than understanding as individuals. Therefore, sentience, motion, and appetites require a unifying principle to organize the random electric signals in the brain. The unifying principle of organic material, including electrons, what we call the soul. Therefore, sentience, motion, and appetites require a soul. So that takes into account our first 4 powers of the soul, which were the mechanisms, while they're there, require something to organize those mechanisms, which is what we call the powers. And then we get to the complicated part of humanity, which is our rationality. We organize what plant and animal life are based on their mechanisms. We understand them by structural comparison, which allows them to put them in genus and species. And similarly, Aristotle does the same thing, that he organizes what a life would be based on the powers of the soul that it possesses. Cognitive ability amongst the scientific community and the philosophical community is the specific difference between man and animal. That man has some ability that puts him above the animals in his way of thinking. Traditionally, what the intellect is the ability to understand universals, to abstract from your particular experience concepts that allow for speculation and contemplation outside of the particulars themselves. However, as we can see based on our brain, that it seems like there's a part for every other aspect of the soul. So why would we not say that there is some part for irrationality? If you see your diagram at the bottom of the code sheet, there are different structural comparisons of different animal brains. Diagram A is of a frog brain, which has the most basic functions that a human would have. So there's the brainstem and cerebellum, and some optic lobe, and also a pineal gland, but on a much lower scale, so they have a much lower function. As you go higher up on the animals, you go to higher animals, like the lizard, for example, has a large olfactory lobe because that allows for because majority of his understanding of his environment is through his taste and smell. And then as you go up to the tree shrew, you can see that there's more cerebrum, which is the gray stuff outside of the central brainstem. And then as you get to the tarsier and marmoset, which are types of monkeys, that you continue to build in cerebrum until you get to the human brain, which has the most complex cerebrum in the animal kingdom. Therefore, if rationality would be some part in the brain, it would be the most developed part of the human brain in comparison to monkeys. Otherwise, we should just have a monkey brain. And the most developed part of the human brain is the prefrontal cortex, in comparison to gorillas and apes, which are most closely related to us in their structure. And this was thought for a long time where our intellect was. Until in 1848, when a rail worker named Phineas Gage had an accident where he was pounding a rail spike in, but it shot up, went through his cheek, and out the top of his head, entirely destroying his prefrontal cortex. What was more baffling than the fact that he survived this incident was that the only thing that changed was his personality. His intellect, his memory, and his ability to solve problems remained the same. That he went from a well-tempered man who didn't talk very much to someone with major anger issues and a drinking problem. Now, this tells us one thing, is that the part that we thought was the most developed in the human brain, the prefrontal cortex, which should have been where our rationality was, doesn't actually control what our intellect is. Therefore, there isn't one particular mechanism that allows for human intelligence. So where does this leave us? We can have two interpretations now of what rationality could be. Either Descartes was right, that if you strip away all of your material mechanisms, you're left with your immaterial mind. Very simple, very nice. Or, as modern science typically does, is we need to redefine what the human intellect is. And rather than saying that it is some immaterial thing, that it is a synthesis of all of our sensory mechanisms. And this is what Thomas Aquinas calls the estimative power, and what modern psychology calls the intelligent quotient, or IQ, which considers intelligence as only the ability of complex pattern recognition and quick problem solving. So rather than saying that you are more intelligent because you understand universals better, we want to say that you can solve problems really well, better than a monkey, therefore you have a high intelligence. La Mettrie, an Enlightenment materialist philosopher, on quote, oh, I do not have a back to my quote sheet. Does anyone have a quote sheet I could use? Thanks. In quote 6 says, quote, "What is more, the similarity of the ape's structure and functions is such that I hardly doubt at all if this animal were perfectly trained, we would succeed in teaching him to utter sounds and consequently to learn a language. Then he would no longer be a wild man, nor an imperfect man, but a perfect little man of the town, with as much substance or muscle for thinking and taking advantage of his education as we have." While this sounds kind of silly, that by saying that human intelligence is entirely its sensory structures would be saying that a monkey brain with just a little bit of evolution and a little bit of training could get to our human intelligence. And this was attempted with Coco the gorilla. Her caretakers taught her how to use basic sign language in order to communicate, which allowed her to tell stories and talk about her children, just as your typical mom would. And as she says in quote 7 in sign language, quote, "Squash meat, gorilla mouth tooth. Cry, sharp noise loud. Bad, think trouble. Look, face, neck, girl hole," end quote. Now, if you don't speak gorilla, I will parse out the story that she is telling you. When she's saying squash meat, gorilla mouth tooth, she is referring to herself eating lunch earlier that day. The cry, sharp noise loud is when her caretaker had dropped something and made a loud noise and a cry. Then her reaction to it was bad, think trouble. And then she looked at the face of her caretaker where she saw that her mouth was open. Neck, girl hole. This is most interesting because this was an event that had happened earlier that day. That Coco was in fact recalling a memory, even if it was in parsed, not very sentence structured monkey language. And this gives a very good argument for why humans would just be monkeys that know language better or can be taught better, and therefore that we don't want to say that there's any sort of materiality to our minds, that rather we are just the sum of our mechanisms, even if it still follows our definition of the soul. Now, both of these interpretations, both Descartes' and the scientific understanding, are true in a way, but insufficient. First, is there evidence for understanding universals apart from language and apart from, is there evidence for understanding universals that distinguishes us from a way a monkey would distinguish universals? Marie George, in her article, Thomas Aquinas Meets Nim Chimpsky, says in quote 8, quote, "Person A, I saw a crazy woman in the supermarket today. She was stacking coffee cans in the middle of the aisle. Person B, well, how did you know she didn't work there? Person A, well, she was mixing up different brands in the stack. Besides, the manager came over to ask what she thought she was doing." This conversation could take a number of directions from here. One person might tell another crazy person's story, or the two might speculate on the causes of the woman's craziness. Or they might start talking about the importance of sensitizing people to, mental illness. Granted, sometimes the ties in conversation prove to be more imaginary streams of consciousness than rational. Still, people often recognize that they are moving from one topic to another, as one can see from the expressions such as changing the subject or went off on a tangent, end quote. That Marie George here is saying the difference between the way a monkey would speak to us and the way that we speak to each other, we don't just talk about particular experiences, but we usually can speculate about them, even if it's not in the philosophical or academic mode. That the two women in the grocery store are still wondering why this crazy woman is acting the way that she is. This tells us two things. This tells us that that understanding universals is not just pattern recognition and problem solving, but it's thinking abstractly from particular experience. Thomas Aquinas in quote 9 says, quote, "Now it must be noted that as to sensible forms, there is no difference between man and other animals, but they are similarly affected by external sensibles. But there is a difference as to the above aspects, the estimate of powers aspects, only by some sort of natural instinct, while man perceives them by means of a certain comparison. Therefore, the power which in other animals is called the natural estimative power, in man is called the cognitive power, which by some sort of comparison discovers these aspects. Therefore, it is also called the particular reason to which medical men assign a particular organ, the middle part of the head, for it compares individual notions, just as the intellectual reason compares universal notions." Coco's story is entirely a particular experience. And while this is an extremely complex behavior coming from a monkey, that it still is different than the way humans talk to each other. That while Coco may be able to compare particular experiences through a particular reason, man can step outside of his particular experience and compare universal notions. They can compare something as universal as mental illness, or compare it to what cans are, or in Coco's story, for example, she's never asked questions about who her caretaker is or why she dropped something, but she can reciprocate the memory. Therefore, animalism, by saying we are entirely our sensory parts, is denying that we can think outside of our present experience, because there isn't a particular part of the brain that allows for you to think outside of universals. Therefore, we are left with Descartes, strangely. And we are left with, if you strip away everything, you're left with your simple material mind. But his understanding is still insufficient. He thinks of man as a driver in a car, that your existence is entirely your angelic mind operating a machine. He is still thinking of the mind as a part or a cog to the machine, but rather than being a material part, it is just an immaterial part operating on the machine. But as we said before, that having any sort of organization in your body, having any sort of organicness to yourself, requires a soul in and of itself. Therefore, the mind can't just operate like another part unless it operates similar to the soul. So we would need to change Descartes' understanding of the mind-body relationship to be, rather than a driver in a car, to be more like a rider on a horse. That two similar natures work together in one unified action. And this is clear with our understanding of universals from what Thomas Aquinas told us in quote 9, that just as the estimate of power compares particular reason, that our intellect compares universal notions, that it has some sort of unifying principle to itself, but instead of having organic material that it also organizes to allow for this action, it unifies the universals on its own. But because it has this unifying principle by its nature, and the human body also has a unifying principle of organization to allow for its actions, then they can operate together in a hylomorphic unity. They can operate like a rider on a horse. The horse can overpower the rider, just as opium can override your mind and make you fall asleep. And the mind can also control the horse through discipline and conditioning. Therefore, Descartes is right in saying that we have some sort of self-evident immateriality, but the way in which he interprets nature disregards the actual beauty of the combination between man and his mind. That there is not necessarily another part added to man that separates him from animals, but there is something integral to his being and united to his being that separates him from the rest of the animal world. So what a piece of work is a man? How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how expressed and admirable. In action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. Man is not only an arrangement of dust. He has a mystery that the rest of nature shares in. Compartmentalizing and dissecting will only get you to a random assortment of particles, but an understanding of the soul will reveal a deeper order in nature. One that is nothing other than the reflection of the divine mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. I also want to ask about the rider and the horse analogy again, and maybe just ask more about what's deficient about that analogy. Why couldn't someone think that the relationship between the immaterial mind and the human body soul composite was like that of a rider to a horse?
Yes, because it seems very clear that there is a distinct person and a distinct horse there, that there's kind of two wills operating together versus one will operating like there is in the human body. So in that sense, the analogy falls short and kind of falls more into the dualist understanding as being entirely distinct from each other. Yes, so in the sense that that in the horse rider analogy, the rider can just get off the horse sometimes and just think without needing the horse. And the horse can do its own thing without we're worrying about the rider on it as well. That there's two wills opposed to each other there, that in the human person, we would need to say that it is not two wills, but one will working simultaneously, that there's one will of the entire rider and horse, that they would have to, it's not quite possible for a human and a horse to think exactly the same way.
So I guess one clear difference there that you kind of referred to is that a rider could stay awake while his horse went to sleep.
Yes.
But our mind doesn't stay awake when our body goes to sleep, or it never does.
Yes.
But in terms of there not being two wills, what would you say to someone who said, well, there kind of are two wills? Because I think about health and my well-being and maybe things about like justice and not. So I decide I say I shouldn't eat that donut. But then I don't know. I really feel like I want to eat that donut.
Yes.
Is that two wills?
Well, I'll defer to Hope's thesis. This is what she wrote on. But that there is a connection between the workings of your body and the way in which you think. That the intelligence itself isn't another thinking process that works separately from your like conscious sentient thinking process, that they are one and the same. And you're asking specifically about sometimes your body kind of impulsively does something that your mind doesn't want it to do. And this happens because there is a unity there. But it's not something that your mind can't eventually overcome, but it does require it to actually work with itself and its body through discipline to actually allow for it to resist the donut or resist other bodily phenomenon. That the pull you feel towards wanting to eat the donut is not something distinct from your intellect telling you not to. It's one and the same.
Is it that there's only like one pool of attention and that it's not simultaneous, like it's one after the other? First I'm thinking about health, and then I'm just thinking about how sweet the donut is. That the way in which we understand consciousness is still a material process in some way, that our mind works temporally and works from one thought to the next versus just being simultaneously knowing everything at once. And that your mind knows everything at once while also not thinking temporally, that the way we come to know things is through logic and reasoning to get to the end, to eventually know things. Okay.
I'm thinking about your Coco example, and you're contrasting that with the conversation about the crazy woman. And I took you to be saying that Coco is always very particular, and the humans are able to somehow universalize. My question is, how do you know that they're universalizing?
I think.
Or what does that mean? Like, is there a test for that? Or
yes, at least Marie George in this example, she says earlier in the article, like the paragraph right before this part, that the behavior of speculation is wondering about first causes and wondering about why things are happening outside of their particular experience. So for the lady in the grocery store, that when they're talking about what mental illness is broadly speaking, that is a universal, versus with Coco, who is saying that like the bad think trouble seems like, oh, she's universalizing about some sort of trouble, but it's more her reaction as being fear, as being a particular thing, versus wondering what general cause could have allowed for it to happen.
Okay. I'm wondering, how would we know whether or not that was a difference in kind or just some difference in degree because her language is so primitive? No.
Are you asking for if Coco, like if we would have taught her how to ask a question, I guess? Yeah.
Are we really seeing a difference there, or are we just, it's kind of not a fair fight because she's working with this really primitive language and and if we could somehow ramp up her linguistic powers, it would start to look exactly like the conversation about the lady in the grocery store. Or do you think that's not possible?
I think that it wouldn't be possible for her to try and think about why things happened or speculate about things.
Okay, good. So if I plug this conversation into ChatGPT, which is like the fancy, I think it's like the really advanced Coco. Maybe.
Something like that.
Then I think I could probably get it to speculate about
Mhm.
like the causes of mental illness, and
Mhm.
is ChatGPT universalizing or?
No, but this is on a very limited understanding of what AI actually does, but that it's statistically based and based on it's more of a complex pattern recognition more than it's actually understanding things as a universal and understood as universals, then recognized in particulars. That it takes in all the information that it's found and then says, okay, this is what most people say about why somebody would want to stack things without, like, why would they go against convention? Oh, it could be because of mental illness. And that seems like what people have said and what the pattern has been in people's speech.
Isn't that kind of what you did when you prepared this oration? Like, aren't you saying things you said before and things based on what you read and conversations you had?
Yes, in a way. At least in the
ChatGPT.
in my ChatGPT. I hope not. I think in terms of having evidence to support the things I've been saying, so my brain diagram that probably came from an AI source, but that the difference is that with my mental process, it was here's kind of an intuitive understanding that I have of the world, and here's a reasoning that I have for it, but how does the information that we have fit into it versus what does the information just tell us?
What was the difference there again? Sorry.
That there is, make it slightly more clear. At least when I started the process of thinking about what man was, that I started with thinking, okay, I have this intuitive understanding that we have this sort of body, and seemingly like the same sort of way that Descartes does, there's this like self-evident immateriality, as well as thinking through it, Philosophy 201. But for setting up this specific oration is I had that like universal intuitive understanding of what man was. And then through the particulars, seeing how those are actually, that is a, how did I say it before? That is a, to recognize in the particulars how it relates to the universals. So you could teach Coco probably a diagram of the brain and teach her like the name for brainstem. But in understanding what man is as a whole and seeing how the particulars fit into that understanding of the universal is because there's an understanding and a speculation of what how the particulars fit into universal concepts.
Okay.
I had a question about pattern recognition. It seems very close to getting an idea of universals, and I want you to see if you can explain to me what the difference is. And I'm looking at quote 9 partly, thinking about the estimative power in animals working by some sort of instinct, and then in man it works by a certain comparison. It seems like pattern recognition, you see a particular, and you do make a certain comparison. Maybe it's not the kind of comparison that Aristotle's talking about in there, but it does seem to be a kind of comparison, and it does seem like you're somehow seeing what is common to the three particulars. And that seems close to how I'd explain what a universal is. What's the difference there?
Yes, you're asking about the particular part of Thomas Aquinas's quote, which moves from because animals have some sort of instinct when they compare things, or instinct, And man uses it as a kind of comparison, but that seems to relate to kind of the ChatGPT example as well, that it seems that ChatGPT can just organize universals by some sort of comparison, not by an instinct, because it doesn't quite have instincts as a computer, or maybe it does. I don't know. But for animals, at least, that they are usually entirely focused on the particular reality in front of them. That sort of the Pavlov's dog example is that it eventually like starts with understanding that the smell of food means food, and it recognizes the pattern between smelling food and seeing food. But then they could eventually train the dog into hearing a bell, which meant food, and that it would start to desire food and salivate when it heard the bell, which seems like almost a sort of comparison, but because it was done through conditioning, it was instinctual, that he just started salivating without thinking, oh, last time I heard a bell, that meant there was food, that it seemed almost immediate there. But with understanding universals in some way, it isn't just an instinct of like, well, there is a certain part of us that understands instincts of like, oh, I've seen this color before because, and you like have like red makes you angry for some reason, and you see the color red and it has this instinctual aspect to it. But then there's also a way in which, oh, I've seen this color red before, and I can compare it to thinking about another particular. So for the first part of that question of being that animals are more instinctual in that respect. And then just that organization seems like a sort of pattern recognition sorry, could you repeat the second part of your question?
Yeah, so I guess my real question is that whether or not they work by instinct, animals somehow have a kind of pattern recognition, ability to recognize patterns. And that seems like, even though that's kind of stuck in particulars, you might think that that requires some idea of a universal in order to even be able to see, hey, this particular is like this particular. Right? I'm seeing what's common to the two. And when I see something that's common to many particulars, am I talking about a universal? Or could I do that and not be talking about a universal? Does that make sense?
Yes. I think it's still based in instincts for animals. For example, that if a deer sees a red berry and a red flower and it's eaten the red berry before and remembers kind of the pain of feeling sick from eating this poisonous berry, it's going to avoid the color red, which seems like some sort of pattern recognition in the deer's head of saying that, oh, I remember this color making me sick, therefore red must make you sick in some way, which seems like some sort of universalizing it. But because it's something reactionary, and it's based on having an experience of pain and its associated experience of pain with color versus generalizing what like the accident of redness is.
Yeah, so even in that example, it seems like to be able to recognize, oh, this is another red thing. It seems like you're saying, oh, red is, I have this general concept of red, and I can see that's a particular red thing that made me sick, and this other thing is a particular red thing. And isn't that calling back to a common universal redness?
I think the difference is that how can I put this? That the accident, at least when humans think about it, that we can think of it abstracted from like a feeling it's caused us or a particular memory that we have with redness through induction over and over again, that eventually we can get to just having it as redness, where I think with the deer, that because it had this one experience of red making me ill, the other situations where it recognizes red, it still recognizes it in its particular and associates it with the particular experience. That it's not thinking about redness broadly, but it's thinking, I've seen something like that before and it made me sick, so I'm going to avoid it. That it's still comparing, or not necessarily comparing, but having an instinctual of this particular memory to this particular experience. Does that answer your question? Sort of. Partly.
Okay, well, we'll open up to the audience.
Clara.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting. So I guess animals and man both seem to have like an animating principle that is this synthesis, like you said, of all of its physical parts, as opposed to just something like the material ruling it. I was wondering with rationality, if it's a different composition of material parts, and then the same type of soul, but it's just able to kind of infuse it with like this new type of rationality, or if there's something in man where it's like, all right, it's so developed that now we can have the same kind of animating soul, but it just has different parts to work with. Does that question make sense?
Sort of. Could you rephrase it?
Yeah. Basically, like, is the rational soul actually different from the like sensitive, motive, nutritive soul? Or is it just that it has more parts to work with? And then what we see as the effect of that is rationality.
Are you asking, is the estimate of power the sort of synthesis between things, and then rationality being something apart from that? And how does it still sort of work with those parts? Yeah. I think we would say that the estimate of power is kind of a synthesis of all of the sensory parts, that it takes in the sensitive information and able to solve problems with it in a powerful way. And then because we want to say that intelligence is not something that is particular because it deals with something outside of material reality, then there is let me rephrase how I started saying this. The way Aquinas described it is that being that they kind of compound on each other in a strange way, that the intellect uses the information from the estimate of power and from sensations and memories and those interior sense powers that it's gathered for better knowing universals. But I wouldn't say that there is necessarily that there are certain actions that seem like complex like intellectual behaviors, or like how we consider IQ, and be always related to our kind of universals, that sometimes that can be a tool for solving problems, but that the synthesis itself can almost operate on its own sometimes. But they kind of work together in that way because they're in one organism. Dominic.
So from quote 9, could you distinguish again for me the estimate of power from the cognitive power?
Yes, that's the sort of that's the comparison aspect that there's that I answered with Dr. Zepeda's question of there being an instinctual ability to pick up on patterns, which is that natural estimate of power. And then there's the cognitive power, which kind of allows you to step out of particular experience and compare particulars. Because what he's saying is that the difference is the above aspects only by some sort of natural instinct when he's talking about the natural estimate in comparison to the cognitive power. that the cognitive power does a comparison that's seemingly outside of the instinctual natural estimate of power. Beth.
Could you mentioned briefly about imagination,
Mhm.
and how animals in thinking about particulars use their imagination, but when we abstract, that's different. But I guess I'm struggling to see why rationality isn't just a very developed imagination,
Mhm.
because I feel like I never think without having a picture
Yeah.
in my head.
Yeah, I think that's because imagination and language, I think, as well falls into this category. It's a very good tool for helping us to understand and communicate things we're thinking. That we kind of have an ability of symbolic knowledge, like having sort of even like your concept of things that you cannot imagine, like God or the Holy Spirit, that we kind of have like a particular imagination when we use that word, or even just the word itself is kind of a particular imagination of it. But it's used to signify rather than actually explaining the entirety of the universal. That if you are imagining God, you're probably doing something wrong, hopefully.
But then that animals never have an understanding that's more by imagination.
Yes, they don't have a concept, and then they interpret this particular imagination to that concept that they can imagine and combine, but only in terms of like particulars. Bella.
I am able to go to a ballet or an opera or something
Mhm.
and sit through and have enjoyment of this experience. Sometimes when I'm not tired or hungry. But it seems like Coco would never do that.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, is that just a byproduct of this ability to universalize? Or are there certain things that this intellectual rational ability is more perfected in, or more ordered to,
Mhm.
or are there parts to the intellect? Why is it that I'm able to do it now, basically?
Yeah, I think there's a distinction made there too, that there are ways in which music or sensations that are pleasing and sound nice to us can also sound nice to other animals in just a very like pleasurable, sensible way. But for man, there seems to be a further digestion of it, you could say, that they recognize some sort of order and some sort of intellectually satisfying thing about an opera, whether it's like the story itself or how the music's composed, that Coco wouldn't be able to pick up on. Yes. A similar situation that is funny is, we talked about this in Philosophy 201, was bears watching sunsets. That there's like a strange phenomenon where bears will just sit and watch sunsets, and it seems like they're experiencing this like human type wonder. And I don't know if they've actually done studies on it or not, but it would seem that there's more of the like the pleasure of seeing colors like that itself versus an actual wondering of it. And so in a way we've kind of anthropomorphized them into thinking that they're experiencing wonder the same way we would, when it could very well be just they like pretty colors and bright lights. Hope.
Can you explain why we can't contemplate while we are in a fight or flight mode?
Probably because it's distracting. So I would think about it. That when you have so much adrenaline in you, you kind of focus on the your material and it can kind of, it can cloud the way that you think about things.
You did say that, my understanding, that the hippocampus is where our adrenal.
I don't know a ton about the hippocampus, but I know it's most associated with memory, but it could also, I know the inner brain has something to do with adrenaline as well.
I think my secondary question to my first question is, if rationality and contemplation cannot be placed into a particular part of the brain and our fight mode does come from a particular part of the brain. Why can't we do like the contemplative thing if it could use all the other parts of the brain and not the area of the brain that goes into fire?
Yes. I think that's sort of related to the fallout of the horse rider analogy, that it does seem like that we want to distinguish between our like immateriality and our materiality. It's very satisfying to distinguish them. But because they are in a unity with each other, that they influence the attention of the entire person. And so you can train yourself some, and there's like Buddhist monks or like contemplative nuns and monks are able to kind of entirely center their attention on this kind of intellectual aspect of themselves versus being distracted by kind of what your body is doing to you. But that's not because that they're like entirely distinct from each other, but because they're able to focus and train themselves to eventually to have control over their mechanisms.
Would you also say that a way to distinguish the abilities of a human being versus an animal or a monkey is that we have the ability to contemplate in movement, like while we're riding a bike or running or riding a horse.
Yeah.
That although we are using our body in like a more elite way than a monkey can, our brain can do something at the same time, but it's all working together.
Yeah, I think that could be true to a certain extent. I think there is still a way in which our mind works in a material way, even if our body's working in a different way. The like kind of dozing off and thinking about something and kind of entirely losing your attention at the present moment. There still is some sort of movement of thoughts to another and imaginations that kind of pop into your head, the sort of daydreaming thing. So it's that sort of thing. I think it's still a material sort of phenomenon that maybe animals could do. I've never been in the mind of a monkey. But the, I guess, contemplation of universals above that, you could kind of forget about material, your body and things, and entirely think about that.
Okay, well, it's 9:15, so let's thank Hayley.